Welcome to this OECD webinar. Welcome to all of our guests from around the world. My name is Bill Diekman. I'm Principal Advisor from the New Zealand Ministry of Education, working on upper senior secondary. Today's webinar is on moving up into upper senior secondary. I'd like to now introduce Hannah. Hannah is the project leader of the Above and Beyond Transitions in Upper Secondary project at the OECD. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Hannah to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Bill. So I thought it would be helpful just to begin by thinking about what is an effective transition into upper secondary education. But I think broadly we can think about that in terms of young people transitioning smoothly into upper secondary education. So for many of you, that might be ISCA 3, or you can think about it as the last level of schooling before young people get a job or go into higher education. And a smooth transition is really about the whole cohort, or the vast majority of the cohort, moving together into upper secondary education at the time they're expected to. The time they're expected to will differ across systems. So most typically across OECD countries, it's at 15, but it might be slightly earlier at 14 or slightly later at 16. But when we look at the data, we see that it's really not a given that everyone will transition into upper secondary education. What we did was we looked at enrollments before the transition into upper secondary. So that's the dark blue line that you see on the figure. And then we looked at rates of enrollment after transition. And that's the light blue triangle that you see on your screens. And you can see that in over half of countries, actually, the rate of enrollment falls after the transition into upper secondary education. In some cases, that's only 2 or 3% of the student cohort. But even if you think it's only 1%, when you're thinking that it's the whole student cohort, that actually equates into quite high numbers in terms of actual real individuals. And I think here's something that's really helpful to bear in mind is that universally, we all have the broad expectation that actually everyone will complete upper secondary, because we know it's probably the minimum they need to be able to get a decent job and also to be able to have a rewarding life. So as soon as you see that some young people are perhaps falling out of the education system before they've even transitioned into this level of education, that's clearly far from ideal. We also wanted to look at where young people were just after they were expected to have transitioned. So again, thinking that the transition age, is typically around 15. It might be a bit earlier, it might be a bit later. We looked at where students were 1 year after that transition. And so you can see the yellow bar, which shows the share of students who are still in lower secondary education 1 year after they've been expected to transition. I think it's important just to mention that in some systems, there are lots of different lower secondary programs and they have varying lengths. So that would be the case in the Netherlands or in Luxembourg or Germany. And that's why you see some students are staying in lower secondary a bit longer. But broadly, in all the systems to the left of the purple line, there are some students staying in lower secondary education longer than the system would expect them to. In some senses, you might think, well, that's okay because students develop at different rates and different levels, and that's really true. But what we know is that as soon as learners are perhaps 1 or 2 years behind their peers, that really increases their risks of disengagement, demotivation, and also ultimately early school leaving. Of course, smooth transitions are not just about everyone transitioning into upper secondary education at the right time. They're also about learners entering programs that interest them, where they can develop the skills and the competencies which will enable them to achieve their aspirations for the rest of their life. So in this piece of work, we were thinking about upper secondary transitions from 2 perspectives. First of all, what approaches support all learners to transition at the expected time? And then what approaches also support learners to enter programs that best respond to their interests, their talents, and their strengths? The first thing we saw when we looked at transitions is, in fact, it's not a one-moment process. In fact, there are 3 parts of upper secondary transitions. The first of those is about eligibility to enter upper secondary education. So pretty much across all OECD countries, there's the expectation that young people will complete lower secondary education to be able to enter upper secondary education. Where the difference is across most countries is that some countries actually check that students have satisfactorily completed lower secondary education. So that's the case across 32 systems, which use academic information to check how students are doing, whereas in 10 systems, all students are automatically promoted into upper secondary education. One of the things that we see in the data is that where there are strict requirements for students to demonstrate they've completed lower secondary education, for example, they have to pass an exam or they have to get satisfactory marks from their teachers, that might be associated with increases in repetition in the last year of lower secondary. And so clearly that's hindering progression. So one of our policy pointers about the entry to upper secondary education was really the importance of promoting all students. So unequivocally saying that all learners, no matter what happened at lower levels of schooling, have the right to access upper secondary education. But on the other hand, we were aware that if all students simply pass through into upper secondary education, any fragilities that they have in their learning might mean that they that they find it quite difficult to adapt to the more complex content in upper secondary education. And I think more fundamentally, having that kind of diagnostic approach to looking at where students are in their learning as they enter upper secondary education is really important so that the system is able to put in place additional supports or different approaches to teaching and learning during upper secondary so that learners are really able to develop the key skills key skills and solid foundations in key subjects like maths and in the national language. The next point we looked at is the one that generates, I think, a lot of debate, especially in European systems, and that's about whether students are directed or oriented towards general education or vocational education. I have to say, I think one of the reasons it creates so much debate and discussion is perhaps not related to the transition system itself, but is more related to perceptions of general and also of vocational education. I think, however, one thing that it's really important to bear in mind, without putting too much focus on the transition system, I think we have to acknowledge that if you have a system where learners with lower academic achievement are automatically directed towards vocational education, your system will always be in an uphill struggle in terms of achieving parity of esteem across general and vocational education. So what we saw across systems was that academic information often plays an important part around those decisions. Countries also might ask teachers or schools to make recommendations, and typically students will always have some choice in the decision about whether they enter general or vocational education. If we want to think about how some of those decisions might actually impact student enrollment and where they are, what we see is that pretty much across all OECD countries, so that's the countries to the right of the purple line there, that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are much more likely and frequently enrolled in vocational upper secondary programs. I think that's related to lots of factors, and those are not just limited to the transition system. But I wanted to pull out 2 points related specifically to transitions. The first one is around the use of academic information, which we saw is very common in countries around the transition decision. What we know is that academic information, academic achievement is consistently associated with students' socioeconomic background. So essentially, if you have a system that just uses academic information to orient students to different programs, there's a real risk that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds will disproportionately be represented in vocational programs. And the other point is around information and how students make decisions. We know that students from advantaged backgrounds tend to have better access to information about their future pathways. For example, if we look at PISA, we look at the students who are very high performing but come from a more disadvantaged background, they are much more less likely to aspire to attend higher education than their high performing peers from a more advantaged background, even though clearly they have all the skills and all the capability to be able to master the content at that level. So thinking about some policy pointers for how learners make decisions and how they're oriented towards different pathways. Our first recommendation or suggestion is the focus on drawing on a broad range of information Clearly, any information that you look at is never going to reflect the fullness of an individual learner and all their talents and their strengths and their aspirations. But if you do draw on a broader range of information that draws on academic information in terms of exams, but also teachers' views, you have a discussion with students, you also talk with their parents, you're much more likely to be able to get a broader representation of what programs might best suit that individual student. And also, of course, the importance of engaging with students and having a real conversation with them about where their interests lie and providing them with information that's up to date and accurate in terms of how their decisions around pathways and programs in upper secondary might lead to different jobs after schooling. The final area we looked at was around programs, specializations, and subjects. You might not think this is actually part of a transition decision, but we wanted to look at it for three reasons. First of all, because these decisions often happen quite early in upper secondary education. Second of all, because they are associated with stakes in terms of the subjects learners can take. So if you don't study maths to a higher level in upper secondary, you might not be able to do it in tertiary education, but also, in fact, whether you're eligible to enter a tertiary education in some systems. And finally, because it's particularly important for systems like British Columbia, that we'll be hearing about later on, and also New Zealand, where Bill is from, because those systems don't have the separation of students into general and vocational education, we might think the transition into upper secondary education is less important in those systems. But because the subjects, the specializations, and the levels that students study at are associated with stakes later on, we thought it was a really important issue to look at. It was a challenging issue to look at because, in contrast with other levels of other types of decisions related to transitions, it's really not very transparent. There's not any national guidance about how those decisions are made. And so one of our policy pointers was really around encouraging greater transparency, particularly because we know those decisions are related to important opportunities, or in fact closing opportunities for learners later on. And finally, I just wanted to talk about how all of that might come together. One of the things that we mentioned in the spotlight that Bill talked about was having a transition recommendation. And here that wouldn't be someone saying to a student, oh, well, you should do vet or you should do general education, but really covering the full range of options in terms of the subjects, the specializations, and the levels that a learner might study at in upper secondary education. And if I just go on very quickly to the last slide, you can see some of the things that we think that might cover. So a student might hear, well, you might want to do general education, you might want to do vocational education, but it would also be about which subjects you might want to take, what level you might want to take those subjects at. And the level is not just about the level of student preparedness for studying that subject, but it's about what they want to do afterwards. I think we can all agree that everyone should do some maths, but maybe everyone doesn't need to do advanced maths if they don't want to study it in tertiary education afterwards. So really bringing together all those different options that a student will be faced with when they go into upper secondary education and engaging them in a discussion about some of those options very early on in upper secondary education, because it's about engaging in that self-reflection and thinking about those future pathways, which will really enable students to make informed decisions as they move through upper secondary education.
We're now going to move into a roundtable discussion. Question for all of you is, how would you characterize the current approach towards managing transitions into upper secondary in your country? What do you think are the strengths and challenges?
Upper secondary education in Sweden is divided in vet and general education. And I would say that our vet is rather academically oriented. This means that an exam from vet gives basic eligibility for higher education. To enter vet, you must have completed 8 subjects in compulsory school at least. And for general education, it's 12 subjects. And it's about 85% of the students leaving compulsory school who meet the entry requirements. The other ones, 15%, they will leave compulsory school, go on to upper secondary school, but start not on upper secondary level. They will start with what we call introductory programs. And it's like a second chance to focus on those subjects from compulsory school they need in order to become eligible. About half of the students in introductory programs, they manage to get over the threshold and enter vet or a general program. It takes them 1 or 2 years. But it's only 1 out of 5 students starting on introductory program who will finally get an exam from upper secondary level. These introductory programs can also aim for working life. And the strength of the system, I would say, is that the threshold for entering upper secondary level, it has a clear function. Having completed compulsory schools successfully is the most important factor for completing upper secondary education with an exam. And it's logical. You need the knowledge from compulsory school. Otherwise, you will not manage the level of studies and the tempo in upper secondary education. And this works fine for the majority of the students. The transitions to and the studies in upper secondary works well. And that goes also for transitions from upper secondary to working life or higher education. That's the strength. The weakness, it's all about these 15% who don't meet the eligibility criteria. They are a very heterogeneous group, but they have one thing in common, and that's failures in school. And many of them had failures for a long time, and not being eligible is a new failure. And all of these failures, they add up, and they will most probably have a negative effect on self-esteem and motivation, and this will create another negative effect, and that's they will have no good school results. So it's totally the opposite from what they need.
Upper secondary is an integrated part of the whole education system in Lithuania. The capacity and motivation of the student to learn according to the upper secondary curriculum requirements are strongly related to the outcomes of learning in lower stages of school. In 2025, we introduced a requirement of a minimal grade 4 in external assessment of math and Lithuanian language after the 10th grade, if the student is planning to continue learning in upper secondary. We do believe that in the long term, public consensus and support for the requirements for the transition from low secondary to upper secondary education will grow. At the same time, we provide a systematic support to a student if she struggles to achieve the appointed requirements in certain grade and subject. Lithuanian students started the 4th, 8th, and 10th grade when they participate in external assessment, get both results of the test and individual report according to her achievements in different content and skill fields. From 2023, we started to organize additional consultations for students who did not pass the required cutoff in 4th, 8th, and 10th grades. In the case of failure to reach a satisfactory level of achievements in certain grades, a student gets an individual learning achievement improvement plan and additional consultations at schools. We will analyze what is the impact of this delivered support to certain students. We also strongly believe that systematic and consistent career guidance is one of the key tools to ensure a professional support for students from the 1st grade to get the information about her capacities and interests. The framework for secondary education has been revised and updated according to deeper and competency-based learning in selected subjects. Since this school year, students could choose to learn mathematics in main or advanced course level. Data shows that ability to choose learning according to different levels responded to the expectations of the students. At the same time, the requirements for secondary education have been revised with the end of school examinations, so that secondary education will require 2 state matriculation examinations in 2025 and 3 state matriculation examinations in 2027. Access to higher education is increased to ensure that it is available to all those who are ready, irrespective of the pathway, academic or vocational, through which the person obtained their secondary education. We do believe that consistent reforming of secondary education stage will help the students to make relevant decisions about the path to higher education or labor market.
In British Columbia, Canada, upper secondary schooling, it takes place at grades 10 to 12, where learners are approximately age 15 to 18, and it aligns with our graduation program. The education system here, it's rooted in the principle of universal transition into upper secondary, and that goal is really to provide a general non-streamed education for all students that's going to lead them towards high school graduation. With this in mind, the current approach to managing transitions into upper secondary is really about providing opportunity and choice for students. Most students won't go into upper secondary knowing exactly what their academic or career path is going to be. So our emphasis is on providing options and choices that are going to enable a wide range of pathways. To be able to support more options for students, we have introduced a future-oriented action plan. It's called Stronger BC, and it focuses on increased work experience opportunities for secondary students as a way of supporting their transition to post-secondary study and to the world of work. The work experience opportunities here they're really seen as complementary to students' academic learning. I wanted to mention that we also provide career education learning for students beginning at kindergarten, and this goes all the way through to grade 12. At grades 10 to 12, we have 2 required career education courses that students take for graduation. And these courses really help students learn about career options, but more so help them identify areas of passion and interest, help them with some practical life skills, and help orient them to the employment landscape in Canada. Career learning at upper secondary is really meant to provide those options for any number of career and life pathways, and recognizing that this is likely a different place than many other jurisdictions as we've moved away from streaming for many years. I would say the strength of this approach is that it provides flexibility for students without the pressure to decide on an academic or career pathway when they're young and they have more uncertainty about these things. It also enables learners to pursue different options post-graduation rather than kind of funneling them into specific paths that can be really difficult to change.
Well, the main conclusion of the working paper on transitions is that transitions should move away from selection and sorting as the main function and aim to provide a more personalized recommendation to students that will guide them through a range of upper secondary decisions and choices. So the question for our panel today is, do you think this policy suggestion is realistic and feasible in your system? What do you see as the potential benefits and challenges to this approach?
For British Columbia, this policy suggestion, it's entirely feasible. The idea of not selecting and sorting students, it's aligned with the approach we've taken here for many years. This is also true of other provinces and territories in Canada. The approach seems realistic for a jurisdiction, as providing these types of recommendations we do see as that being really helpful for students. General education that supports non-binding post-secondary study pathways and career counseling for all students is really the ideal complement from our perspective. Personalizing the approach, it can provide students who want more structure with structure and those who want more flexibility with that flexibility. And while that flexibility, it can be valuable for many students, others will benefit from clearly knowing what courses they need to take, what grades they need to achieve, and all of those sorts of things for certain programs. I also think providing an overview of multiple different options can also expand students' thinking about what they might want to do post-graduation, and how being strong in a particular subject like math could be useful in a variety of academic and vocational pursuits. I would say an obvious challenge here is coordinating individualized pathways, because that would require really significant collaboration here with post-secondary institutions and employers, and to be able to ensure that all of the information that students are receiving is accurate. I'll also mention that in BC, we offer dual credit programs where students gain credit towards secondary graduation and post-secondary credit at the same time. We're in the process of changing our dual credit policy from one that requires a career declaration that can be really potentially limiting to students to one that permits a number of exploratory dual credit courses prior to any of that specialization. I think a clear benefit to the approach is that with work experience, it supports students' passions and interests. It helps them focus on one or more related career trajectories. It's very student-centered. It doesn't prescribe courses or experiences. It asks students instead to be able to map their journeys based on what's meaningful to them. And I really think the success of the policy suggested will depend on the capacity of educators and career counselors within that education system to be able to curate these pathways for individual students and how personalized, detailed, and specific the student recommendations would be.
So Lithuania has just started, to introduce the changes in upper secondary education, but potential benefits could be highlighted right now. Since September 2022, all 60 municipal schools already have career specialists. So we have over 500 working with students from the first grade. Career specialists operate in accordance with approved procedures for providing career guidance in schools. Students can get the relevant and personalized information about their future choices, alternative ways to obtain education in different types of schools. Another important beneficial change in Matura exam is started to implement too. In addition to the regular matriculation exams, there will be intermediate exams for students in secondary school in 11th grade, starting next year in spring 2024. We consider that the midterm examinations could assure the consistent process of learning during the 2-year period of upper secondary education. The provided results of midterm examinations could be used as a source of self-evaluation to a student about his strengths and in fields of learning where she has to make additional efforts to achieve his goals according her interests, abilities, and capacities. Naturally, we try to manage the potential risks and challenges of this great reform. We understand that educational system after 20 years of liberal transition to upper secondary education is not ready at 1 year properly to manage the student flow to vocational education or to provide any other relevant alternatives for students who do not pass the requirement to obtain basic education. We meet the discussions with local politicians in municipalities who try to do their best to keep the certain number of students at school at the level of the secondary education, despite the fact that these students do not have the required skills or motivation to learn on a certain level. We consider that the taking up reforms in upper secondary are necessary, and I strongly believe into the efficiency of started reforms, which will bring the positive and effective consequences to the whole society.
First of all, thank you for an excellent working paper. And I think this paper and the longer version as well is a very useful tool for policymakers and stakeholders to sort out a very important aspect of the educational system. I've been thinking a lot about what this should mean in a Swedish context. And the main conclusion in the paper that transitions should move away from selecting and sorting as the main function and aim to provide personalized recommendations. It's like in Sweden, students who are eligible for upper secondary education, they do their choice on their own. They will have support and guidance. And that's an important aspect of the Swedish system. But if moving away from selecting and sorting means to take away the threshold into upper secondary education, I don't see that coming in Sweden. We could debate the levels, but to take them away, I don't think we are ready for that, and I don't know if anyone would benefit from it. And when students leave compulsory school, they should, of course, have career guidance and help to do their choice. But I think it's difficult to give all students a personalized recommendation. But of course, it depends on what you mean by that. But who should do this recommendation? What should it be based on? For how long would such a recommendation stand? And maybe most of all, it might be the case that students start to define themselves by this recommendation. And then when it comes to support and a personalized recommendation for the pathway, the subjects. In Sweden, it is the case that a student chooses a program, a pathway, and there are many of them. And these pathways are mostly nationally decided. So they do some, the students do some decisions on specializations, but they don't have to have so much support about different subjects. I would say that the Sweden transition to upper secondary education is framed by these eligibility criteria, requirements, and then within these they choose on their own. But I think that OECD has a big point here to about the personalized recommendations, if it's about supporting them with correct information about the pathways, because Swedish upper secondary education is a little bit of a market, and for a student in compulsory school trying to understand what upper secondary is all about, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish, is this neutral information or is it marketing about the school? So I think it's very important that, as OECD mentioned, to support students with neutral information. And I think also that one important aspect in this policy recommendation is about helping them to find like a balance and between what is fun in the short run, what would be interesting education, and what will I use it for afterwards. So, and I think it's important to help the student to, of course, find a training and education that is fun, but also how should I use it afterwards. So I think the paper, very important for us as a tool for understanding our system. I think for Sweden, we need these eligibility criteria because if you don't meet these standards, you will have very difficulties to go through upper secondary education. But I fully agree and all about information and support and guidance in the choice of education. Thank you.
There's been mentioned in the chat that learners need some hands-on experience. So do students in your systems, have the opportunities to get hands-on experience, and practical work experience before they make choices in upper secondary or while they're going through upper secondary? How do you think that interacts with the findings of this paper and what you see for your education system?
I think in compulsory school, they will over and over talk about the different options and they will have support from career guidance. But they also make visit to upper secondary schools because the schools, they try to attract students and they will try to show what they have to offer. So most of all, they visit the schools.
I would say that students have opportunities to engage in work experience learning. I would also say that there are more of those spaces that exist within trades-based programs. I would also add, though, that with the work that we have done on our career education, specifically for grades 10 to 12 within the graduation requirements, there's an expectation for students to do a capstone project that's a culmination of their learning. And a key piece of that is to be able to have a mentor that supports them in that process of developing their capstone. And often that gives them some of the connections to those areas of interest that they may wish to pursue for post-secondary or career and those sorts of next steps.
My background is chemistry. I really understand very well how the hands-on activities are important in science, and not only science, natural sciences. So also we have two parts what we implement in our upper secondary education. We have a Matura project. It is not mandatory, it is optional. So students can choose to do a Matura project, and which might be evaluated. And this is the way the students can take really hands-on activities, and we can evaluate competencies-based outcomes. What we also have that we have a mandatory voluntary civic activities. So it means that every student in upper secondary education, a certain number of hours will have to dedicate for volunteering. And also it's really related with hands-on activities involved, to be involved in parts of societies or even in some business companies or whatever, but they will decide to do some volunteering. So I think these two parts, which I wanted to mention, will also involve students to have more hands-on activities.
From my perspective with this question, it's quite an interesting one, because in our upper secondary system, if you want to do, practical vocational experience, go work on site at a construction site or something through one of the many programs which are available, we recognize that there can be significant trade-offs in terms of what subjects you might be able to do at school, which can obscure some of the trade-offs and choices that we have in our own education system, in terms of what that transition into upper secondary can look like and what the experience in upper secondary can look like. Things which might not necessarily be visible from a system-wide view, as you might have when you're discussing in this international context. We have another question in the chat from Graham from Scotland. In Scotland, we have been working to blend traditional academic learning and vocational learning in upper secondary. Timetabling is a challenge. How is your system responding to these types of needs, balancing the needs between these types of education in your system?
One of the things I think that I would mention is that in British Columbia, we too are, I guess, kind of in a space where we're trying to provide more of that balance and between these sorts of programs. And I think that it's important to try and break down any of that false dichotomy and misleading stereotypes about vocational or trades, kind of training versus academic pursuits. For the timetabling piece in Canada, this is really managed locally. I have heard though from school districts here that it is a significant area of complexity, and one in which often, unfortunately, can be the piece that will drive what opportunities and options become available. So I see that as a space where more needs to be able to be done so that the learning is really the driver.
So how we implement all the changes in the upper secondary education with the new system we started this year. So we have a minimum number of hours for academic teaching, and for regular gymnasiums, we have 25 hours, the minimum for academic teaching, and maximum 35 hours. And we reduced the minimum number for vocational education from 25 to 17 hours. And I believe this also gives a part for vocational training and for vocational and education and training more time to do practical works. Of course, timetabling and challenges how to organize all the schedule in real school is still an open question, but usually the schools deals with it and quite successfully.
In Sweden, if you choose to go the VET pathway, you will have about 25% of your studies is general subjects, and it's the same subjects as in parts of it in general education. And you will have, if you manage to get an exam, basic eligibility for higher education. And I would say that our VET is rather academically oriented, and maybe a challenge for us, and that we're working on right now, is we maybe need a more practically oriented VET as well, because some of the students who have had difficulties with more the academic subjects in compulsory school, and when they enter our VET, some of it's a little bit too difficult, too much math and English and so on. So we need to have both of them. And what we're also looking into is how the students who enter general programs, if they should have the options to choose some vet courses as well, because some of them, they find out during their general 3-year program, I might not go on to higher education. And then we need to offer them some vet courses to enable them for a smooth transition to labor market. So we are trying to mix it a little bit more than it is today. Thank you.
I think we'll have time for one more question. And Pam Kearney has got quite a good one. What do you think of the lack of parity of esteem regarding vocational pathways and apprenticeships compared to higher education pathways, when in the long term salaries or prospects may be comparable?
I've been working with this issue for many, many years, and I think it's the problem in most countries that vet is not so popular. It's the $10,000 question. What we try to do in Sweden, we introduce those subjects that give them basic eligibility to higher education. And for some students, that's very important, because when they are in the last year of compulsory school, they are not sure what they want to do in the future. So they want to keep as many doors open as possible. So offering vet with the basic eligibility to higher education is one way, but the backside of that is it makes vet rather theoretical. So we need to have both of them. And I also think it's important to understand how we talk about different about vet and general education. And sometimes I think it's like, even in the educational system as civil servants, we have a little bit of an academic bias and consider the academic way as a little bit better. And I think we should be a little bit careful about that and talk about salaries, for example. If you go through general education, you don't have vet, and you don't go on to higher education, it's what do you do then? So, but it's a difficult question.
I just can agree that it's really $1 million question, you know. And I think, yes, the key answer is that we must have all doors open at any stage. And this is the key question. So right now we also established like short-term courses between vocational, educational, and to enter university education and so on. So, but yeah, it's very, very, very difficult and complicated question, you know, to do attractive vocational studies and to take all these courses.
I think the only thing that I'll add to the complexity here is there's something I think really inherently philosophical in this, and it's about what we value as a society really at large. And we've all talked about having options and pathways for students, but I think it's about, you know, as a society, valuing what all of those look like and being able to recognize with students that all of those roles are needed for being able to maintain life in all of our countries.
I think that's I think that insight really sort of like wraps up that issue quite well in terms of what's quite important for many of our jurisdictions in terms of, you know, raising that parity of esteem and, you know, what is it that we truly value here. Thank you to all the participants, Fritjof, Angie, and Ramonas. You've provided some very interesting insights. I'm sure many of us have learned a lot today. And thank you to all the audience members who've participated in chat and sent us questions. You've enriched this conversation greatly. Now we're going to move on to Anna from the OECD, who will wrap up. Anna is policy analyst at the OECD and is the author of the OECD working paper. Our question for you, Anna, as the author of the working paper, Managing Student Transitions into Upper Secondary Pathways, you dedicated a lot of time thinking about these issues and looking at different countries' practices. Given your experiences, we'd like to hear your insights on today's discussion. also in relation to your personal experience in your home country or with other countries you've worked with.
Thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar. I don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to say that I've learned a lot during the process of writing the paper. And actually, one of our main goals with it was to facilitate international comparisons and have discussions like the one we're having now, based on what we have identified as being some of the main challenges and practices in place during transitions into upper secondary education. So thank you again for everyone that is here. And I thought it would be relevant to say a few words about my home country, Brazil. And there are many things I could say about it, especially as the country is now introducing major reforms into upper secondary education with the goal of flexibilizing the system, increasing school time, and especially giving students more options from the beginning of upper secondary education around different specializations and different pathways. I can go into the details of the reforms also because it's still being discussed, but I think what's interesting given today's discussion is that despite extensive media coverage and discussions that are happening based on public consultations, I've personally found very little information available around what are or will be the orientation mechanisms available to help students better understand the different programs and specialization options that will be made available to them. And it's actually already the case in some states, depending on the schools. In Brazil, currently, the only requirement to enter upper secondary education is the successful completion of lower secondary education based on school-based assessments. And this new reform aims to allow all students to choose whatever program and specialization they want to follow, but then not all schools will be able to offer all of these different pathways that they're thinking of implementing. So I think that over the coming months and potentially years, because the implementation is going to take a little bit of time, it will be very interesting to observe if the country will rely on different sources of information to establish new requirements for entrance into these different programs and specializations, and what will be the mechanisms in place to orient students in their choices.
Thank you, Anna, for your insights here, and also thank you for preparing the paper, which has led to today's webinar. So it's time to close today's webinar. So you can check out the Spotlight paper online. There will be a second webinar on the design of upper secondary education in early 2024. And if you're incredibly interested and passionate about this topic, I encourage you to hop along to that one too. So thank you everyone for your time. And good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you are.